Somewhere in a drawer, or more likely now in a cloud folder you never open, there is a photo of you before you could talk. Someone is holding you. You are looking at something just off camera. Maybe a dog, maybe a window, maybe nothing at all. You have no idea what you were looking at. You have no idea who took the photo, what the room smelled like, whether you were happy or annoyed or about to cry, or what happened 5 minutes later. You were there. Your eyes were open. Your ears were working. Your brain was, by every measurable standard, alive and processing the world around you. And yet none of it exists for you now, not even as a fragment, not even as a feeling. Most people assume this is just ordinary forgetting, the same slow fade that erases what you had for lunch 3 Tuesdays ago, just stretched out over a much longer span of time and a much younger brain. But the real answer is far stranger than simple fading, and far more deliberate. Your brain during those first few years was not failing to hold on to memories the way a leaky bucket fails to hold water. In a very real, very physical sense, it was actively tearing them down. This gap has a name, and it is not a recent discovery. It is called infantile amnesia, and the man who first gave it that label was Sigmund Freud, writing at the turn of the 20th century. Freud noticed something that any adult can confirm for themselves. Try as you might, you cannot recall almost anything from before the age of 3 or 4, and what little you do recall tends to arrive as a single disconnected image rather than a full scene with a beginning, middle, and end. Freud, being Freud, decided the explanation had to be psychological rather than biological. He proposed that the earliest years are saturated with desires and conflicts too threatening for the conscious mind to tolerate, so the brain represses them, locking them away in the unconscious rather than letting them surface. It is a compelling story, the kind that fits neatly into a larger theory of hidden drives and buried trauma. It is also almost certainly wrong. Repression implies the memories are still sitting in there somewhere, intact, theoretically retrievable if you just found the right key, the right analyst, the right hypnotic suggestion. Modern neuroscience tells a very different story, and it starts by asking a much more basic question than Freud ever considered. Can babies even form memories in the first place, or is the whole system simply not switched on yet? For a long time, developmental psychologists assumed the answer was no. Infants seemed too neurologically raw, too unfinished to encode anything that would last. Then a researcher named Carolyn Rovi-Collier ran a deceptively simple series of experiments that flipped this assumption upside down. She tied a ribbon from a baby's ankle to a mobile hanging above the crib, and she watched what happened next. The babies, some as young as 2 or 3 months old, quickly figured out that kicking their leg made the mobile shake and spin, and they kicked more and more eagerly the longer the connection held. That part alone was interesting, but not shocking. What came next was the real surprise. Rovi-Collier brought the same infants back into the lab weeks later, reattached the ribbon, and watched them start kicking immediately, before the mobile had even moved, as though their bodies already knew exactly what to do. These were not vague, generalized reflexes. These were specific, detailed memories of a particular event, retained accurately across a gap of a month or more, in a brain barely out of the womb. So the old assumption that infants simply lack the hardware for memory does not survive contact with the data. Something else has to be going on, something far more specific than a brain too underdeveloped to record experience in the first place. That something else lives largely inside one small, curled structure buried deep in the temporal lobe called the hippocampus. Picture the hippocampus as a staging area, a place where the raw, scattered sensory pieces of an experience get gathered up and stitched into something coherent enough to be filed away for long-term storage elsewhere in the cortex. In an adult brain, this stitching process runs on a relatively stable, well-established production line. In an infant and toddler brain, it is anything but stable. The hippocampus, during your first several years of life, is one of the most chaotic, fastest-changing construction sites in your entire body. And that chaos, it turns out, is the real culprit behind everything you cannot remember. Here is where the story earns its own named explanation, the one that most memory researchers now favor over Freud's repression theory. It comes largely out of the work of a neuroscientist named Paul Franklin, who studies how memory develops in young brains, both human and animal. Franklin and his colleagues proposed what has come to be called the neurogenesis hypothesis. Neurogenesis simply means the creation of brand new neurons, and your hippocampus produces new neurons at an extraordinary, almost frantic rate during early childhood, far outpacing the rate at any later point in your life. On its face, this sounds like it should be pure upside, more neurons meaning more capacity, more intelligence, more room to grow. But Franklin's experiments, including studies where his team deliberately sped up or slowed down the rate of neurogenesis in young mice and then tested what the animals could and could not remember, revealed something almost paradoxical. Every one of those freshly grown neurons needs to wire itself into the existing network, and to do that, it has to compete for the very connections that older, established memories are already using to stay intact. In effect, the new cells shoulder their way into a crowded neighborhood, rearranging and overwriting the specific circuit patterns that had been holding your earliest memories in place. It was never that your infant brain failed to write the memory down in the first place, the way Rovi Collier's mobile experiments already proved it could. It is that a construction crew came barreling through months or years later and knocked down the filing cabinet to make room for newer, more useful furniture. This single idea reframes the entire mystery of your missing years. Your earliest self was not some blank, unfeeling machine incapable of experience, waiting passively for a switch to flip. Quite the opposite. Infants form real attachments, recognize the specific faces of the people who care for them, learn routines, anticipate what comes next, and yes, form genuine memories, sometimes with striking precision, exactly as the kicking babies proved. What you lost was never the capacity to remember. What you lost was the structural stability of the storage system itself, torn apart and rebuilt over and over by the very same neural growth spurt that was simultaneously making you smarter, faster, and more capable with every passing month. There is something almost poetic buried in that trade-off. The identical biological process that builds a brain capable of language, self-recognition, and complex abstract reasoning is the same process quietly erasing the record of the years it took to get there. It is worth pausing here because it would be easy to walk away from this and conclude that early childhood simply does not matter, that if you cannot consciously remember it, it left no real mark on who you became. That conclusion deserves some real pushback and some genuine nuance. The neural circuits built during those unremembered years do not vanish, along with the explicit, story-shaped memories sitting on top of them. Attachment patterns, stress responses, emotional reflexes, even certain deeply ingrained preferences can be shaped by experiences from infancy and can persist for the rest of your life, encoded implicitly rather than stored as a scene you could consciously replay if you tried hard enough. So, this is not an argument that the first few years of a child's life are a throwaway period, and it is certainly not an argument that caregivers are somehow off the hook, simply because none of it will ever be consciously recalled. The absence of a retrievable memory is not the same thing as the absence of an effect. Your brain was keeping score the entire time, just not in a format you would ever be able to read back to yourself. By the time you reach somewhere between 3 and 7 years old, the exact age varying quite a bit from person to person, your hippocampus finally began to slow its frantic pace of new neuron production. The wiring stabilized. The memories you were forming by that point finally had a reasonable chance of surviving into adulthood without being bulldozed by the next wave of neural construction. That gradual transition is exactly why most people's earliest surviving memories tend to be hazy and fragmentary, more like single freeze-framed snapshots than continuous scenes, and why full, story-like recall generally does not stabilize until somewhere around school age. Think about what that means every single time you catch yourself in a moment of unexplained unease around a stranger who reminds you of no one you can name, or a sudden wave of comfort in a room that smells a certain way for reasons you cannot pin down. Some researchers suspect these flickers are the implicit residue of circuits laid down before your explicit memory system ever came fully online, echoes of an architecture that was later dismantled and rebuilt, leaving behind a feeling with the paperwork missing. This is also, in a strange way, why you should stop trusting anyone who claims to have a crystal-clear cinematic memory from age 1 or 2. Developmental psychologist Patricia Bauer, who has spent much of her career mapping exactly when autobiographical memory comes online in young children, has shown that so-called memories from that early tend to be reconstructed rather than recalled, quietly stitched together after the fact from photographs, family stories repeated at dinner tables, and the ordinary human habit of filling gaps with plausible detail. The brain is not lying to you on purpose. It is simply doing what it always does, building the most coherent story it can out of whatever fragments happen to be available, even when the honest answer is that almost nothing from that period survived the renovation. So let's run the timeline, start to finish. Roughly 600 million years ago, the first primitive neurons appear in early animal life, laying the groundwork for anything resembling memory at all. Around 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans emerge, carrying brains built on that same ancient hippocampal blueprint. In 1899, Sigmund Freud publishes his theory of repressed early memory, giving the phenomenon its first name and its first, ultimately mistaken, explanation. Through the 1980s, Carolyn Rovi Collier's mobile experiments demonstrate conclusively that infants can and do form specific, lasting memories, dismantling the old idea that babies simply lack the capacity to remember. In 2014, Paul Franklin's research on neurogenesis and memory turnover finally offers a mechanical, testable explanation for exactly where those early memories go. And right now, in your own skull, that same hippocampus, long since stabilized, is quietly filing away the memory of reading this very sentence, one memory among countless thousands from today that you will very likely still be able to recall decades from now. So the next time you flip past that old photo of yourself as an infant, staring at something just out of frame, remember this: you were not too undeveloped to notice the world around you. You noticed everything, more than you will ever know. Your brain simply had more urgent work to do than preserve any of it, tearing down its own early architecture again and again to build something sturdier in its place. The person in that photograph is gone, not because you failed to hold on, but because becoming who you are today required letting go of exactly that.